Trump's new press secretary just obliterated Ilhan Omar and the entire Democratic establishment, exposing their blatant hypocrisy on live TV. You won't believe how she turned the media's own words against them. Now picture it. The room was packed, cameras clicked, and murmurs rippled through the press corps like an electric current, a mix of anticipation and quiet hostility. Karoline Leavitt stepped onto the podium, her movements measured and controlled. The press room was buzzing with quiet murmurs as reporters braced themselves, laptops open, cameras rolling. The air felt charged, not just with anticipation, but with something sharper. She adjusted the microphone, her eyes scanning the room. She already knew how this would go. This wasn't just a briefing, it was a setup. A political chess match where the media held their pre-written narratives like loaded weapons, ready to fire. She gave them a polite smile, but there was steel behind it. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began, her voice clear and steady. "I know you've all been eager for this briefing, so let's get right to it." A pause, a calculated beat of silence. "Before we begin, let's establish something," she continued, her tone sharp but controlled. "If the media is going to set the rules of outrage, they should at least be consistent about it." A few reporters shifted in their seats, sensing where this was going. Karoline placed her hands on the podium, locking eyes with the front row. If a Republican stood here today and said, "We need to fight in the streets," you'd all be foaming at the mouth, demanding resignations, congressional investigations, maybe even arrests. But when Ilhan Omar says it, suddenly it's just a passionate plea for justice. The room tensed. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The reporters had come prepared to attack her, but Karoline had just set the terms of engagement. A hand shot up, Peter from CNN, predictable as ever. He cleared his throat, his voice laced with carefully measured skepticism. "Karoline, are you suggesting that Ilhan Omar's comments were meant to incite violence?" Karoline tilted her head slightly as if Peter had just asked her if water was wet. "I'm not suggesting anything, Peter. I'm quoting her. Or do you deny she said it?" Peter hesitated. The camera zoomed in, catching the flicker of uncertainty in his face. Karoline leaned forward slightly, pressing in. "Let's be clear," she continued. "When Democrats call for fighting in the streets, it's dismissed as rhetoric. But when a Republican so much as breathes the wrong way, it's a threat to democracy. So tell me, Peter, what's the rule here? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like the rules only apply to one side." Peter opened his mouth, then closed it. No response. Another reporter, a woman from NBC, jumped in, trying to shift the angle. "Surely you're not suggesting that the president is above criticism? Ilhan Omar was simply expressing concerns about this administration's policies." Karoline turned to her, unimpressed. So was every conservative who got labeled a domestic extremist for daring to question the Biden administration. Funny how that works. Silence. A few furrowed brows, some shuffled notes, hoping to find an angle to trap her. But she wasn't done yet. She glanced at the cameras. This moment wasn't just for the reporters, it was for every American watching at home. "Let's play a game," she said, her voice calm and measured. "Imagine if President Trump stood here today and said, 'We need to take this fight to the streets.' What would happen?" Nobody answered. The silence stretched just long enough before she filled it herself. There'd be front-page hysteria, emergency broadcasts, calls for impeachment. The media would be in full meltdown mode, but Ilhan Omar says it? Nothing, just another Tuesday. More silence. The energy in the room shifted. The press had come here to corner her, but now they were the ones on the defensive. Then a voice broke through. "Karoline." It was James from NBC, a veteran journalist. His tone was measured. "Are you saying that outrage over political rhetoric is selective?" Karoline turned to him, raising an eyebrow. "I don't need to say it, James. You all prove it every single day." More murmurs. Someone whispered to a colleague. Another reporter hastily typed notes, fingers tapping against the keyboard. Peter from CNN tried again, this time sharper, more aggressive. "But Karoline, don't you think context matters? Ilhan Omar was referring to—" "Oh, I love that word. Context," Karoline interrupted, tilting her head. "Because when President Trump said, 'Peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard,' you all conveniently ignored the context. In fact, you used it to try to throw him in jail." A ripple went through the press corps. Someone coughed. Another reporter muttered something under their breath. Peter clenched his jaw, but before he could formulate a response, Karoline held up a hand. You want to talk about context, Peter? Let's talk about it. Ilhan Omar didn't say peacefully and patriotically. She said, we have to fight in the streets. So I'll ask again, why is it different? Silence. No one wanted to answer that question. Then, as if on cue, a phone buzzed from the front row. A reporter glanced at the screen, eyes widening before looking up. Karoline noticed. What is it? She asked casually. The reporter hesitated. Ilhan Omar just tweeted about you. Karoline let out a quiet chuckle. Of course she did. She turned back to the room, expression unbothered. Let me guess. She's calling me dangerous, maybe even a racist. Classic. She reached for the iPad on the podium, pulling up the live tweet. Then, in a clear, deliberate voice, she read it aloud. Karoline Leavitt is spreading dangerous rhetoric to distract from Trump's reckless agenda. She looked back at the room, her eyes scanning the reporters. That's cute. But here's the thing, her words are on video, plain as day. And she doesn't get to decide what's dangerous and what's not. The press corps sat in silence. They knew she had a point. They just didn't know how to admit it. Karoline took a breath, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. This wasn't over, not even close. She straightened, her eyes sharp. Next question. The room was still, but the tension was suffocating. The press had walked in expecting to control the narrative, yet here they were, cornered. Karoline tapped her fingers lightly against the podium, waiting. She knew someone would try to shift the conversation to regain control. James from the Washington Post was the first to take the bait. Karoline, he started, measured but firm. You're quoting Ilhan Omar's words, but are you really suggesting she meant it as a call for violence? Karoline tilted her head slightly, as if amused by the question. James, am I supposed to believe she meant it as a poetry reading? A few low chuckles rippled through the room. James cleared his throat, pressing forward. But rhetoric is open to interpretation. You're treating her words as dangerous, but what about Trump's past statements? Don't you think some of them could also be seen as incendiary? Karoline gave him a slow nod, as if he had just walked into her trap. Oh, I see what you're doing, she said. So, now intent matters. That's interesting. She let that hang in the air for a second before continuing. Because when Trump said, peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard, the media spent years claiming it was a call to violence. James shifted slightly. He didn't like where this was going. But when Ilhan Omar literally says, we have to fight in the streets, suddenly we need context. Silence. Karoline nodded, her tone steady but sharp. This isn't about heated rhetoric, James. This is about who is allowed to use it. A few reporters glanced at each other, some typing frantically, others waiting for a counterattack. Peter from CNN took the shot. Karoline, you say there's a double standard, but let's be honest, Trump's rhetoric has led to real-world violence. Can you honestly compare that to Ilhan Omar's words? Karoline let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. Oh, Peter, she sighed. You people never disappoint. She reached for her iPad, swiping quickly before turning the screen toward the cameras. This is Bernard Felix, she said, just arrested for attacking a Republican volunteer. Shouted that they deserve to die. She swiped again. This man firebombed a GOP office, told police he was following orders. Another swipe. And this? She paused, letting the silence build. This is the man who shot a Republican congressman on a baseball field. No one spoke. Karoline set the iPad down, folding her arms. So tell me, Peter, she said, her voice smooth but cutting, do these count as real-world consequences? Or does political violence only matter when it fits your narrative? A visible shift occurred in the room. Reporters looked uncomfortable, a few avoided eye contact. Then, from the back, a younger MSNBC journalist forced a question out. But Karoline, he said cautiously, you're cherry-picking cases to make a broader claim. Isn't it dangerous to suggest that one side is responsible for all political violence? Karoline turned to him, eyes narrowing slightly. So now we care about nuance? The reporter stiffened. Karoline continued, her voice firm. I find it funny how Trump supporters get blamed for everything from election protests to a hoax in NASCAR, But when a Democrat literally says, we need to fight in the streets, suddenly we need to look at the bigger picture. She let the question linger in the air and nobody answered. She exhaled slightly, checking her watch. We're barely 20 minutes in, and you've already proved my point. She tapped the podium once, looking back up. The truth is, this was never about fighting rhetoric. It was always about controlling who was allowed to speak. Still no response. She straightened, ready for the next battle. The tension in the press room was thick. Reporters shuffled their notes, recalibrating. The narrative wasn't going how they had planned. Karoline Leavitt had just dismantled their selective outrage over political rhetoric, but they weren't done. They had another card to play. James from the Washington Post leaned forward, pen tapping against his notepad. Karoline, he started carefully measured, let's talk about Elon Musk's new role. The president's decision to appoint him as head of the Department of Government Efficiency, isn't that just a way to reward a billionaire ally? A few reporters nodded, sensing a possible weak point. Karoline almost laughed. Here we go. Oh, so now you all care about billionaires influencing government? She folded her arms. That's funny because I don't remember any of you complaining when Mark Zuckerberg was spending $400 million to influence elections. Silence. She pressed on. Or when Jeff Bezos was receiving billions in government contracts while owning a newspaper that conveniently never criticizes the left. Peter from CNN interjected quickly, trying to regain control. But Karoline, Musk isn't just any billionaire. He's been openly aligned with Trump's policies. Isn't this appointment just a case of political favoritism? Karoline didn't even blink. You mean the same way Hunter Biden received cushy foreign business deals while his father was vice president? Or the way Nancy Pelosi's husband magically made all the right stock trades before major legislative decisions? The room stiffened. Funny how political favoritism only seems to be an issue when it involves someone the media doesn't like. James adjusted his tie, pushing forward. But Karoline, let's talk about oversight. Elon Musk now has access to government systems, specifically in the Treasury and DOJ. Shouldn't the American people be concerned about a private businessman having influence over public finances? Karoline leaned in slightly, her voice firm. Let's get our facts straight, James. The DOJ engineers Musk is working with only have read-on access to Treasury systems. They cannot write new code. A few reporters exchanged glances. They knew she was right. She continued. And let's be honest, what really bothers you isn't Musk having oversight. It's that he's actually going to expose how much taxpayer money has been wasted. The room fell silent for a second. Then, from the back, a young journalist from NBC raised her voice. But Karoline, Musk's companies, including SpaceX and Tesla, have received millions in government subsidies. Doesn't that create a conflict of interest? Karoline tilted her head slightly, unimpressed. That's interesting because the Biden administration literally appointed former Google and Facebook executives to government roles overseeing tech regulations. A few cameras zoomed in, catching the growing unease in the room. But somehow that's not a conflict of interest? More silence. Karoline scanned the room, sensing that the energy had shifted. They weren't getting the attack angle they wanted. She decided to drive it home. This administration was elected to drain the swamp, to cut waste, and to make government run like a business, not like some slush fund for career politicians. She let the words settle. Now I get it. The media doesn't like that because if the government actually became efficient, what would the Democratic Party campaign on? A few suppressed chuckles, a few glares. Karoline checked the time. All right, she said, knowing they weren't done yet. Next question. The press had failed to corner Karoline on Elon Musk, but they had another attack ready. Peter from CNN jumped in. Karoline, NBC reports that some illegal immigrants arrested under Trump's policies aren't being deported. Instead, they're being released with ankle monitors or phone check-ins. Isn't that a failure? Karoline barely held back a smirk. She had seen this coming. I'm glad you asked, Peter, she said. Let's talk numbers. She glanced at the cameras. As of this morning, over 8,000 illegal immigrants have been arrested under President Trump's policies, she stated, and out of those, only 461 have been released. That's less than 6%. Silence. But the media spins it as if mass releases are happening. James from the Washington Post pushed back. But Karoline, doesn't this prove Trump's policies aren't working? Why is anyone being released at all? Karoline didn't blink. Some were released due to medical conditions, others because detention space is limited. She tilted her head. And who's blocking funding for more detention centers? She let the question hang. The reporters knew exactly who was responsible. A young MSNBC journalist jumped in. But Karoline, many of these individuals haven't committed crimes. Are you treating all undocumented immigrants as criminals? Karoline laughed lightly. Oh, so now you care about the difference? She scanned the room. I remember when you all called Trump racist for deporting gang members. A few reporters shifted uncomfortably. But let's be clear, she continued. Entering this country illegally is already breaking the law. Peter from CNN tried again. Are you saying the administration has no responsibility for these releases? Karoline locked eyes with him. We are deporting as many as possible, but when Congress blocks resources, they can't turn around and blame us. Silence. She checked the time. Well, she said, her tone light but firm. Next question. The media had failed to pin Karoline on immigration, but they weren't done yet. James from the Washington Post leaned in, flipping through his notes. Karoline, the president has made it clear that Palestinians have no choice but to leave Gaza. But they say this is their home. How does the administration justify this? Karoline remained composed, her eyes scanning the room. The president's goal is simple, she said. Rebuild Gaza, ensure peace, prevent another war. A slight pause. But let's be honest, she continued. The media keeps asking what Trump is doing, but never asks why Gaza is in ruins in the first place. A few reporters stiffened. Why is Gaza unlivable today? She asked, letting the silence stretch. Because Hamas, a terrorist group backed by Iran, launched a brutal attack on Israel. They slaughtered civilians, took hostages, and used Palestinians as human shields. Peter from CNN jumped in. But Karoline, are you saying Trump bears no responsibility for this crisis? Karoline let out a quiet chuckle, shaking her head. I'm saying Hamas started this war, she stated. But instead of demanding that Hamas surrenders, the media is demanding Trump explain his response. She let that sink in. A young MSNBC reporter pushed forward. But Karoline, Palestinians say they don't want to leave Gaza. Is the U.S. prepared to force them out? Karoline met her gaze. No, she said firmly. The U.S. is not forcing anyone out. We are prepared to help rebuild, but we will not allow another Hamas-controlled war zone to emerge. James from the Washington Post pounced. The president said he's willing to use the military if necessary. Does that mean U.S. troops will be deployed? Karoline leaned forward slightly, her voice steady. The president has not committed to U.S. boots on the ground, she clarified. But he's keeping all options open because when it comes to national security, he won't play political games. Some reporters looked dissatisfied. They wanted a reckless statement, but she didn't give them one. She let a moment pass. The real question is, she said, scanning the room, why aren't you asking Hamas to surrender? Silence. A flicker of discomfort crossed James's face. Another journalist from NPR tried to redirect. But Karoline, there are concerns that Trump's stance on Gaza will escalate tensions with key allies. What is the administration doing to prevent further instability? Karoline exhaled slightly as if she had been waiting for this question all along. The president has already spoken with Egypt, Jordan, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia, she revealed. We're coordinating with our allies to ensure that the region stabilizes. She folded her hands. But the media keeps pretending that Trump is making rash, unilateral decisions. A few reporters looked down at their notes. Others typed away, already spinning their stories. Karoline checked the time. Well, she said with a knowing smile, next question. The media had failed to trap Karoline on Gaza, but they weren't done yet. If they couldn't win with facts, they'd try something else. Misrepresentation. Peter from CNN adjusted his mic, ready to strike. CNN is reporting that you suggested illegal immigrants aren't deserving of humane treatment. Do you stand by that? Karoline's brow lifted slightly. She knew where this was going. Peter, she said calmly, would you mind reading exactly what I said? Peter hesitated. He glanced at his notes, then back at her. Well, in context, no. Karoline cut him off smoothly. I asked for exactly what I said, not your interpretation. Silence. Peter cleared his throat. I don't have the direct quote in front of me, he admitted. Karoline smirked. Of course you don't. She tapped on her iPad, pulling up the transcript herself. Allow me to help, she said, turning the screen toward the cameras. She read aloud, I said illegal immigration is a national security crisis, and the Biden administration's policies have made it worse. She looked up at Peter. Where exactly did I say anything about immigrants not deserving humane treatment? Peter's jaw tightened. Well, the implication was... Karoline held up a hand. No, Peter. CNN didn't report what I said. You twisted it. A ripple of murmurs spread through the press room. She wasn't done yet. This is exactly what the media does, she continued. You don't like what I actually said, so you invent a version that fits your narrative. James from the Washington Post tried to jump in. Karoline, even if the wording was misinterpreted, don't you think... Karoline cut him off, flipping the screen to a new tab. Let's talk about misinterpretation, James. She tapped on an article headline from MSNBC. It read, Karoline Leavitt refuses to deny Trump will use U.S. troops to remove Palestinians. Karoline looked around the room. Raise your hand if you were here when I answered that question. A few journalists hesitated before slowly raising their hands. Karoline leaned forward. Did I say that Trump would use the military to remove Palestinians? Silence. Anyone? She pressed. More silence. She tilted her head. Because what I actually said was, and I quote, the president has not committed to U.S. boots on the ground but is keeping all options open to maintain stability. She let the words sink in. But MSNBC decided to rewrite reality, and now Twitter is filled with people believing a completely false headline. A young MSNBC reporter shifted in his seat. Karoline, that headline is just an interpretation. Karoline laughed lightly, shaking her head. Interpretation? She repeated. No, that's called a lie. She scanned the room. This is how it works, she said. The media creates a false story, spreads it across every platform, and hopes people never fact-check it. She glanced at the cameras. And if you don't believe me, just wait until tonight's news coverage. A few journalists looked uncomfortable. Others were already rewriting their narratives. Karoline checked the time. Well, she said with a knowing smile, next question. The press had been caught red-handed twisting Karoline's words, but they weren't giving up. When they couldn't trap her, they pivoted to Trump. James from the Washington Post leaned forward, his voice careful but pointed. Karoline, you've spent a lot of time criticizing the media's handling of rhetoric, he began, but let's talk about the president's own words. Karoline tilted her head slightly. Here it came. James continued, flipping through his notes. The president has a history of strong language. Many would say inflammatory language. He's called political opponents enemies. He said we need to fight back hard. Given today's climate, don't you think his rhetoric contributes to division? Karoline let out a slow breath, then met his gaze. You mean the same way Ilhan Omar told her supporters to fight in the streets? James hesitated. Or the way Chuck Schumer threatened Supreme Court justices, saying they would pay the price? James opened his mouth, then closed it. Karoline folded her hands. This is what the press does, she said. When Democrats use aggressive rhetoric, you call it passionate advocacy. But when Trump says something strong, you call it incitement. Silence. Peter from CNN jumped in, trying to regain control. But Karoline, the difference is Trump is the former president and current leader of the GOP. His words carry weight. Don't you think he has a responsibility to be more careful? Karoline leaned forward slightly, voice steady. Did you ask Joe Biden that? She challenged. Peter blinked. When Biden called Trump's supporters semi-fascists, where was your concern about division? When Hillary Clinton said Republicans were part of a basket of deplorables, did you ask if she was responsible for political violence? Peter stiffened, but Karoline wasn't done. Because when a far-left activist shot up a Republican baseball practice, nobody blamed Democratic rhetoric. When a man attacked Supreme Court Justice Kavanaugh's home, nobody asked if Chuck Schumer's words contributed to that. She let the words hang for a second. But when Trump says, fight back, suddenly the media acts like he's calling for civil war. The press room fell silent. A younger journalist from MSNBC spoke up hesitantly. But Caroline, Trump has been accused of encouraging January 6th. Shouldn't he acknowledge the impact his words had? Caroline laughed lightly, shaking her head. Oh, I love this game, she said, because when Trump told supporters to peacefully and patriotically make their voices heard, you twisted it into a call for violence. She turned slightly, gesturing toward the reporters. But when Biden said in Philadelphia that Trump's supporters are a threat to democracy while standing in front of a blood-red backdrop, you didn't call it dangerous. You applauded it. A few journalists looked uncomfortable. Caroline scanned the room, eyes sharp. You don't actually care about rhetoric, she said. You care about who's saying it. Peter shifted in his seat. But Caroline, if Trump runs again, shouldn't he be more careful with his words? Caroline let out a slow exhale. The media has spent years demanding that Trump change his tone. She paused for emphasis. But has the media ever changed its tone about Trump? Silence. Did you ever stop calling him a threat to democracy? Did you stop comparing him to a dictator? Did you ever acknowledge that his supporters are millions of everyday Americans, not some extremist fringe? She scanned the room. Of course not, because the media's job isn't to demand civility, it's to demand submission. No one spoke. Caroline checked the time, then looked back up. Well, she said with a knowing smirk, next question. The press had tried everything from twisting Caroline's words to blaming Trump for division, but nothing had worked. Now they had a new strategy. They weren't going to attack Caroline themselves. They were going to let Ilhan Omar do it for them. Midway through the briefing, a reporter in the back suddenly looked up from his phone, eyes wide. A few others whispered among themselves, glancing at their screens. Caroline noticed immediately. What is it? She asked, arms crossed. A journalist from MSNBC cleared his throat. Well, Caroline, he said carefully, Ilhan Omar is live on Morning Joe right now, and she's talking about you. A murmur spread through the room. The camera zoomed in. Caroline smirked. Oh, she said, tapping her earpiece. Well, let's hear it then. A producer rushed forward, holding up an iPad with the live MSNBC broadcast on screen. Ilhan Omar sat across from Joe Scarborough, her expression tight with frustration. This administration is dangerous, Omar declared. Karoline Leavitt is spreading lies to cover up for Trump's failures, and let's be clear, she is deliberately putting people's lives at risk. Caroline raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Omar continued, her voice rising. The way she dismissed concerns over Trump's rhetoric, it's reckless. It's a direct threat to democracy, and let's not forget, she's using the same dog whistles that the far right has used for decades. The MSNBC host nodded in agreement, then added, Caroline even questioned your comments about fighting in the streets. Do you want to clarify what you meant? Omar didn't hesitate. Yes, she said firmly. I was speaking metaphorically. I was calling for people to stand up against this administration's attacks on our rights. But Caroline is twisting my words because she's desperate to distract from what's really happening. The clip ended. The press room sat in silence, waiting for Caroline's response. She took her time, letting the weight of it settle. Then finally she said softly, shaking her head, That's cute. Her voice smooth and controlled. But here's the problem. She gestured toward the reporters. You all just heard what Ilhan Omar said on live TV, that she was speaking metaphorically, that she wasn't actually calling for violence. A pause. Now, let's rewind. She tapped her iPad, pulling up the exact quote from Omar's speech. She read it aloud. We might actually see somebody get killed. We have to fight this in the streets. She looked back at the room. Tell me, she said, voice sharp, what part of that sounds metaphorical? Silence. She let the quiet stretch, then continued. This is what they do, she said. They say something extreme, then when they get called out, they claim they were misinterpreted. She tapped her mic lightly, her voice dripping with amusement. So, let's get this straight. When Ilhan Omar says, fight in the streets, we're supposed to assume she means protest. But when Trump says, fight like hell, we're supposed to assume he means a coup. A few reporters exchanged uneasy glances. Caroline leaned forward slightly, voice lowering. It's not about what's being said, she said. It's about who is saying it. She let that sink in. Another reporter, trying to salvage the moment, spoke up. But Caroline, aren't you just doing the same thing, taking Ilhan Omar's words out of context? Caroline sighed dramatically, shaking her head. See, that's the difference, she said. I didn't invent what she said. I didn't twist her words. I played the clip exactly as it happened. She tapped her iPad again, flipping it toward the cameras. I'm not the one spinning a narrative, she said. She is. Silence. The press had nothing to say. Caroline checked the time. Well, she said with a knowing smile. Next question. The press had tried everything, twisting Caroline's words, blaming Trump, letting Ilhan Omar attack her live on air, but none of it had worked. Omar had walked straight into Caroline's trap, and now the media needed a way out. James from the Washington Post was the first to attempt an escape. Caroline, let's move on, he said, flipping his notepad. The president recently made some strong remarks about the economy. Can you clarify? Caroline held up a hand, stopping him cold. Oh, no, she said, shaking her head. We're not moving on just yet. James hesitated. The tension snapped back into the room. You all just spent the last 20 minutes framing me as the problem, Caroline continued. Let's not suddenly pretend like this Ilhan Omar situation never happened. Silence. Caroline glanced at the cameras. America deserves to see this, she said. This is how the media works. A few journalists shifted uncomfortably. Peter from CNN jumped in, voice tight. But Caroline, we've already addressed Omar's comments. We've given you a chance to respond. No, Peter, she cut him off. You gave Ilhan Omar a chance to rewrite her own words. She folded her arms. I'm just wondering when the media is finally going to hold her accountable the way you hold Trump accountable. Peter's jaw tightened. Are you suggesting we haven't covered Omar fairly? Caroline tilted her head slightly, eyes narrowing. Well, let's test that, she said. She pulled up a set of headlines on her iPad and turned the screen toward the cameras. Here's how you covered Trump, she said, reading them aloud. Trump's violent rhetoric inspires insurrection, CNN. Trump's words are a threat to democracy, Washington Post. Trump's dangerous speech sparks extremism, MSNBC. She swiped again, revealing a new set of headlines. And here's how you covered Omar. Ilhan Omar calls for action on civil rights, CNN. Omar's passionate speech highlights political divide, NBC. Ilhan Omar urges Americans to fight for justice, MSNBC. She looked up. Spot the difference? Silence. The reporters knew they had no answer. Caroline tapped the iPad lightly, her voice calm but cutting. This is the double standard Americans are tired of. She let the words sink in. James tried again, desperate to change the subject. Well, Caroline, as I was saying, the president's economic policies… Caroline shook her head. Oh, so now we want to talk about the economy? She asked. Now that the Ilhan Omar scandal is blowing up on Twitter, you all suddenly want to pivot. A few reporters glanced at their phones, seeing the backlash unfold in real time. Caroline sighed, looking directly at the press corps. You can try to change the subject all you want, she said, but Americans see what's happening here. She set her iPad down, crossing her arms. This isn't about what's right. It's not about truth. It's about who gets protected and who gets destroyed. Silence. Caroline checked the time again. Well, she said, a small smirk forming. Next question. The press had tried everything, twisting Caroline's words, blaming Trump, letting Ilhan Omar rewrite reality, and now desperately trying to pivot away from their own hypocrisy. But Caroline wasn't letting them off that easy. Peter from CNN, clearly agitated, adjusted his tie and leaned in. Well, Caroline, he said for composure, we've covered a lot today, but let's end on this. What do you say to those who believe the Trump administration is fostering division in this country? Caroline let out a slow breath, shaking her head. I say that's the biggest lie the media has ever sold the American people. Silence. She placed her hands on the podium, her gaze locking onto the cameras. You call Trump divisive, she said, but who spent the last 8 years telling half the country their race that their faith is outdated, that their values are a threat to democracy? Some reporters glanced at each other, unsure if they should push back. Caroline continued. The media doesn't fear Trump, they fear what he represents. She leaned in slightly. Because he proves something that terrifies them. They don't control the people anymore. A few reporters looked uncomfortable. Some furiously typed away, crafting a new angle. Karoline let the silence settle, then smiled slightly. "So, now the question is," she said, looking directly at the press corps, "what happens next?" She let the words linger. The room stayed silent, waiting for her to say more. She didn't. Karoline checked the time, straightened her papers, and stepped back from the podium. She didn't storm out. She didn't slam the media. She simply turned and walked away. Reporters shouted after her, cameras flashed, but Karoline never looked back. And just like that, the briefing was over. But the real battle? It was just beginning.